They say the Israelis are committing genocide, that the Israelis are like the Nazis, that the Israelis are as bad as Hitler. Now, what is this? First of all, we have to hit on the head the idea that the Israelis are committing genocide, which is rife out there. It would be the only genocide in history in which the population massively expanded during said alleged genocide. The population of Gaza has shot up in the last 18 years since Israel withdrew. So you could say that they are extremely unsuccessful genocidists, or people who would like to commit genocide but haven't managed to for some reason. But none of the analysis of what is actually happening, and I and anyone else who has traveled through the region widely can tell you this, it is nothing like, for instance, what Bashar al-Assad has done to the Syrian people over the last 13 years. It's nothing like what has been happening in Yemen in the last decade. It is not anything approaching a genocide that is happening in the West Bank or Gaza. So why do they say it? Second, why do they say like Hitler? Third, why do they say like the Nazis? These young people have been brought up with only one bit of knowledge from history, which is Nazis. And if you only know about one thing from history, it's likely that you will decide that the whole of history and the whole of the current day can fall into two groups of people and be analyzed by the lens of this one thing. Hitler, not Hitler. Unfortunately, these young people are throwing out the only nasty accusation they know, and they are picking it up from people who are handing them the nastiest thing that they could say. Why do I say that? They are picking up from mainly Muslim pro-Palestinian voices and pro-Hamas voices and others, these allegations which come from the Muslim world against the Jewish state because the Muslim world knows how much it will wound the Jews. That's why they say that. They say the Jews are just like the Nazis because they know how much that would hurt any Jew. Now, these young people who pick up these arguments, knowingly or otherwise, are repeating this slur on the Jewish people. And some of them will know how much that hurts the Jews and will not mind. Some of them may not know how much that hurts the Jewish people. Why do these so-called pro-Palestinian peoples keep saying that it's just like the Warsaw Ghetto in Gaza? Why choose the Warsaw Ghetto? Why not choose something not involving Jews? Why not choose anything else from the history of the world? First of all, by the way, it's not a very good comparison, is it? Because when people managed to escape briefly from the Warsaw Ghetto, their first thing was not to run out and behead the first child they could find. But park that for a moment. Why do they choose the Warsaw Ghetto? Because they want to hurt Jews. They want to hurt them as deeply as they can. Here's the other thing. If you have this great mistake of thinking that the whole world can be divided into Hitler and not Hitler, these kids, and kids they are going to discover, if they have their way, that they were Hitler. Why do I say that? Because if their chant came true, and from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine, which is to say a state which is Judenrein, because Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, as well as Hamas, who of course have been running, if you can call it that, the Gaza for the last 13 years, since they killed the Palestinian Authority representatives in Gaza. Both Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the allegedly moderate PA, and Hamas both agree that Palestine must be Jew-free. There is no scenario in the heads of the Palestinian Authority or of Hamas in which one Jew is allowed to live in the Palestinian state. So if from the river to the sea a Palestinian state is created, it will mean either the eradication of all Jews in Israel or the displacement of all Jews in Israel, which means carting out every Jew from their historic homeland and either killing them or sending them somewhere else. And that would be done in the name of being anti-Nazi. These people have a huge problem coming their way if they get their way, they're ignorant as hell, and they will have to hope to God that they never get what they say they want.
Have really paid a huge amount of attention to. I say that with some regret now, but nonetheless. What has struck me is I don't understand the double standards that seem to apply to Israel. I'd never really paid attention to, and therefore I haven't, but I don't understand. I mean, we're talking now about proportionality. And this is
They always do, as long as it involves Israel.
And I haven't understood what that means exactly, because I don't think Israel would want to go into Gaza and butcher innocent civilians in the way that Hamas did. And also, in a war, proportionality is moronic. You're trying to win.
Yeah, of course.
So why are people calling for proportionality?
Because they want Israel to lose. That's all. No, the international community always does this. There's, not much love lost across much of the world for Israel, for the same reasons as I described much of the Muslim world not having much love for Israel. Becomes the whipping boy, the scapegoat of the international community. The joke that the UN should have a football team. They would say, well, who would they play? Israel, obviously. There was a vote at the UN the other day, a few days ago, which simply called for one thing, which was the international condemnation of the Hamas massacres of the 7th of October. It didn't pass. The UN couldn't bring itself to vote to condemn the massacre of the 7th of October. And when it was announced in the hall that it hadn't passed, there was much whooping and clapping. Now, we've seen this before, of course. In 1975, there was a resolution at the United Nations in New York that Zionism is racism. One of those proposing this motion was Idi Amin, fine, upstanding gentleman.
A good guy.
Yeah.
And again, people watching who don't know who Idi Amin is, educate yourself. And the evening that the vote was put to the UN, a drinks reception was held at the United Nations for those voting that Zionism was racism. And who was hosting the drinks party? Kurt Waldheim. Again, people can look him up. Kurt Waldheim is the former Chancellor of Austria. He was a member of an SS battalion in World War II. So, the United Nations has been here before, plenty of times. The United Nations can never bring itself to condemn anything unless it involves Israel. And that is a pathology of the United Nations. But we have seen all of this before, many, many times. Too many times to count, ever since the foundation of the state. And that comes to one of the simple problems of, and I'm sorry, but we have to bring it up, anti-Semitism. One of the simple problems about anti-Semitism is, as everybody who knows about it knows, is that it's a shape-shifting virus. At one point in the history of Europe, in the history of our own country, the Jews were hated because they were poor, and then they were hated because they were rich. They were hated for not integrating, and then they were hated for integrating. In the era where you could hate people for their religion, they were hated for their religion. Then when that became impossible in Europe, you couldn't hate people for their religion, they were hated for their race. Then at a particular point in Europe, we discovered we couldn't hate people for their race anymore. So what did we hate people for if they were Jewish? We hated them for being stateless. Then the Jewish people got a state, and they were hated for having a state. Now, you cannot tell me in this situation that there's a coincidence here. It is not a coincidence that every way you do it, it ends up like that. And great figures, including somebody I've quoted a lot in recent days and weeks, Vasily Grossman, the great Russian novelist, the author of Life and Fate, among other works.
And everything flows.
He said everything comes from this. And of course, the great thing that Grossman said at the heart of his great novel, in those few pages where he writes about anti-Semitism, about the dark heart of the 20th century, as he goes from Stalingrad to Treblinka, the great pages in which Grossman takes the time out to talk about anti-Semitism in the midnight of the 20th century. He says, of course, that he says some of what I've just said about anti-Semitism being a shape-shifting virus, because of course Hitler had it, as rather well known, but Stalin ended up with it as well. I mean, it goes every direction, everywhere. But as Grossman greatly says, the thing about it is that it tells you about the person who suffers from it, not about the Jews. He says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. People who hate the Jews for being religious have religious problems themselves. People who hate the fact that Jews have a state that they're willing to defend have a problem with defending their own state themselves, and much, much more on and on and on.